Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Schelfhout, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas at Austin. And this is my presentation for the 2020 Sport and Society Conference, which will be held online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This presentation is called Measuring Nationalism and Conflict Through the Africa Cup of Nations Qualification Process. And the big question we're trying to tackle here is, does nationalism make violent conflict more likely, or are its effects largely constrained by strategic realities? International relations scholars have viewed nationalism as an important source of interstate violence, as it can increase enmity between countries, undermine international cooperation, motivate societies to fight costly wars, and cause governments to overestimate their relative military power. Some scholars question whether fluctuations in nationalism can actually cause conflict, and given the difficulty in measuring nationalism, one scholar claims that sporting events can be used as an appropriate proxy of nationalism to measure subsequent aggression. In a paper titled Nationalism and Interstate Conflict, Lessons from the History of International Sports, Andrew Bertoli in International Studies Quarterly examines how nationalism leads to international conflict by investigating several cases where surges of nationalism from sporting events, particularly the World Cup qualifying phases, led to military or political conflict between countries. Many studies show that they often lead to feelings of national unity and hatred towards other countries, and these sentiments result in frequent outbreaks of nationalistic violence at games, and at times they have clearly intensified rivalries at the international level. In a contrarian view, it is very difficult to show a causal relationship between nationalism and conflict, as existing political disputes underlying the conflict might create the nationalism or vice versa. No data set exists that tracks nationalism across an international system in a comprehensive way. And even though nationalism often appears to increase the lead up to war, it is very difficult to show that this relationship is causal. So this study that I will be presenting today will seek to replicate this Bertoli study by using data from the Africa Cup of Nations qualifying phases from 1991 to 2007. The Africa Cup of Nations is held every 2 years in rotating host countries on the continent. It is undoubtedly one of the most visible tournaments hosted in Africa. Scholars have cited the tournament as promoting nationalism in countries participating, much like the World Cup and the World Cup qualifying phases. In addition to using the conflict variables in Bertoli's data, this study will chiefly use militarized interstate disputes, MIDs, to measure aggression. And this study will also include data from the Social Conflict Analysis Database, which I'll refer to as SCAD, which includes protests, riots, strikes, and other social disturbances in Africa. The idea of the regression discontinuity model is to compare the group of units that score just above the cut point to the group and score just below it. And I'll explain that in my study as we move forward. In the case of Africa Cup of Nations, the study will also look at countries who just barely qualify and countries who just narrowly missed out to analyze if nationalism does make interstate conflict more likely, or if its effects are largely constrained by strategic realities. So I think I'll first address the theoretical foundations of nationalism before I dive into the rest of the paper. So political philosopher Ernest Gellner uses this definition of nationalism, which I'll read aloud. Nationalism is primarily a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. Nationalism as a sentiment or as a movement can be best defined in terms of this principle. Nationalism sentiment is the anger aroused by violation of the principle or the feeling of satisfaction aroused by its fulfillment. A nationalist movement is one accentuated by a sentiment of this kind. So nationalism is an ideology which, in Gellner's definition, provides a sense of identification that is so powerful that it can compel them to act in ways that would not be possible without the powerful sense of belonging in the nation state. And a few mechanisms have been attempted to measure nationalism, but the most notable are the spiral model and the paper tigers model. So the spiral model, which is also referred to as a security dilemma, posits a situation in which, under anarchy, actions by a state intended to heighten its security can lead other states to respond with similar measures, producing increased tensions that create conflict, even when no side really desires it. This tool is popular when measuring ethnic and nationalistic conflict. In cases of mass hostility, hostile masses choose belligerent leaders and engage in actions which provoke a security dilemma and escalating, quote, spiral of hostility and security, end quote, which eventually results in war. But the paper tigers model In turn, explains that a surge in nationalism can make the public more hawkish by causing them to view other countries as paper tigers, which are both hostile and militarily weak due to the perceived inferiority of their societies. So this shift in public opinion can give leaders more incentive and opportunity to take military action against another state. So in general, nationalism is a powerful force in an ever-changing world, and while it might be hard to grasp or measure conceptually, scholars have taken steps to make the idea more concrete. One day of doing this is imagining nationalism through the lens of sport. So Bertolli's study found that surges of nationalism can influence interstate conflict, stating that nationalism should continue to play an important role in the study of international relations. In his study, he uses a regression discontinuity model to sort national football teams into treatment and control groups, with teams narrowly qualifying going into the treatment group and teams narrowly missing qualification going into the control group. Prior to World Cup qualification, these two groups had very similar records of aggression. His central claim is that the fact that this increase begins after qualification accords with historical evidence showing that many countries experience a surge of nationalism when their countries qualify for a World Cup. As political scientist James G. Kellis asserts, the most popular form of nationalist behavior in many countries is in sport, where masses of people become highly emotional in support of their national team. And Alan Berner claims that sport and nationalism are arguably two of the most emotive issues in the modern world. Both inspire intense devotion and frequently lead to violence, which makes the linkage of both sport and nationalism easy to comprehend. This appeal to emotion is as strong an appeal as any in politics. Sport has gained a foothold globally, and the ease of leaders to grasp its emotive power through nationalism or nation building makes it a popular mechanism to advance political interests and shape public opinion. We can point to real-world examples of how nationalism is present in international sporting events and how this sentiment is extended beyond the field of play. Using sporting events provides a convenient opportunity to test this effect, and it offers a way around the measurement effect that has confounded nationalism studies in the past. The following test that I will attempt to replicate based on Bertolli's study will attempt to show how interstate conflict arises in countries that nearly qualify and miss out in the Africa Cup of Nations. So for this study, the national football teams on the continent of Africa are chosen as a primary focus for a few reasons. First, I wanted to test Bertolli's hypothesis on a continental scale to see if interstate conflict arises for sporting events with a little less clout than like the World Cup qualification or World Cup qualifying rounds do, but where expression of nationalism remains present. The game of soccer holds a different meaning for its fans, as journalist Steve Bloomfield observes. Soccer in Africa often reflects the political and cultural structures that a country is experiencing. As mentioned earlier, these struggles can be co-opted through the mechanism of sport, and perhaps we see higher levels of aggression if the game is more directly tied to the fans experiencing the matches. In addition, with the influx of capital in the continent from sources like the US and China, Africa is an interesting case to explore as the sport of soccer has grown, producing athletes who have represented some of the top clubs in the world, including Chelsea's Didier Drogba and Manchester City's Yaya Toure, and in the English Premier League, and FC Barcelona's Samuel Eto'o in the Spanish La Liga. It should be mentioned that intrastate conflict, intra instead of interstate conflict is included in addition to interstate conflict in the test that I will soon be running. I claim that in the sporting context, intrastate conflict shares key tenets with interstate conflict that make the effects measurable in the model. Nationalist conflict can occur within the borders of a single state due to the presence of international teams and fans, classifying this as intrastate violence. Bertolli uses a mechanism that examines countries within 2 points of each other paired with a 5-point minimum score requirement between qualifying and non-qualifying teams, which is the same approach that is planned on being emulated in the following study. Regression discontinuity is effective in studies of this type for its ability to identify causal effects, and similar to Bertolli, I will be running that in this presentation as well. In constructing the treatment and control groups, I analyzed the final standings of each group that produced a qualifying team at the Africa Cup of Nations qualification rounds from 1991 to 2007. The Africa Cup of Nations takes place every 2 years, typically starting in January and ending in February. The host country and previous title holder qualify automatically, while all other countries eligible to compete are required to qualify through playing other countries throughout the Confederation. This can be done in 2 ways. The first is by playing a round-robin format style of matches with other countries and earning a certain position in the standings, or 2, by winning a playing game. Like Bartoli's study, this study focuses on the standings format for each group in the Africa Cup of Nations qualification round, which is, for example, shown in this table on your screen. Under this format, countries that were very close to the qualification cut point went to the World Cup or stayed home based on minor differences in the records after many games, which means that the countries close to this cut point, above or below, should be close to random. So what we expect to see in our results is an increased level of interstate and intrastate violence in teams that qualify for the Africa Cup of Nations tournament compared to teams that narrowly miss qualification. This is because countries whose teams qualify for a major tournament, such as the Africa Cup of Nations, experience a surge of nationalism that translates into social or interstate conflict. So a set of hypotheses are put forward in line with the results that Bertoli found in his study. So the first hypothesis is that countries that qualify for the Africa Cup of Nations will experience more interstate conflicts than non-qualifying countries during the qualification period. The second hypothesis is that countries that qualify for the Cup of Nations will experience more intrastate conflicts than non-qualifying countries following the qualification period. And the third hypothesis that I'm putting forward for the study is that countries that qualify for the Africa Cup of Nations will experience an increasing number of intrastate conflicts compared to the previous year than the non-qualifying countries following the qualification period. And the way that we'll do this is by going through the database mentioned earlier, SCAD, which will compare sort of these countries together. So in total, the entire sample consists of 84 countries, which are listed on this table. And the methodology for selecting the years 1991 to 2007 are restricted to the availability of the data used in this study. The SCAD database starts logging social conflicts starting in 1990, while other databases considered for this paper cut off data collection around the year 2008. 11 of the 42 pairs shown on this table are actually tied in the standings, with ties broken on goal differential. So for this study, I decided to run the difference in proportions test to see if countries that narrowly qualified and countries that narrowly missed qualifying for the Africa Cup of Nations experienced different spikes of conflict. The results in the following table show that interstate conflict did not really vary following the qualification rounds of the Africa Cup of Nations tournament. Of the 15 countries that were engaged in interstate conflict during the year-long period following the qualification rounds, more than half of those were solely providing secondary war support for neighboring countries, which could classify these countries more as allies than perpetrators of interstate conflict. So when we're looking at the relationship between interstate violence and the effect of the Africa Cup of Nations, two-sample t-test shows there is no real statistical significance as shown by the p-value in row 1. This sparse number of interstate conflict in this period comes as no surprise, however, as the number of these sorts of conflicts has drastically reduced following wars of independence against European colonial administrations. Upon gaining independence, about half of the anti-colonial wars degenerated into civil wars, and interstate wars between African countries have been pretty minor and brief, mainly concerning territorial or cross-border disputes. During the contemporary era, there have actually only been 2 interstate wars that have risen above a, quote, minimum magnitude measured in the study. But to measure intrastate conflict, which rows 2 through 4 do, the number of conflicts taken in 1 year before and 1 year after the exact date of qualification or elimination of each country is used. So the type of event is coded on a scale from 1 to 10, which increases in intensity the higher the number is. So for example, 1 would be equal to a peaceful organized demonstration, and 10 is equal to intra-government violence. So for this study, only social conflicts measuring 7 to 10 were included, as these types of conflicts measured violent events. So rows 2 through 4 measure this effect of intrastate violence in relation to the Africa Cup of Nations. And largely these results don't really meet our expectations, as the T-stat scores in rows 2 and 3 are going the opposite direction of the hypotheses we listed earlier. Row 3 shows that countries that failed to qualify for the Africa Cup of Nations were more likely to be involved in intrastate violence following the qualification period, which means that it saw at least 1 conflict in the year following its elimination. The one instance where we do see a statistical significance is the number of interstate violent conflicts following Africa Cup of Nations qualification. Countries that qualified for the tournament experienced a significantly higher number of interstate violent conflicts than those who failed to qualify for the tournament. Robustness tests were also taken, but I needed to cut these out to save time on the presentation. But if you're interested, please contact me for that data as well. So to drive this point, I do want to mention some examples of interstate violence that have happened as a result of events on the pitch. And these three examples represent only a few examples of violence that have occurred at all levels of African soccer, including World Cup qualifying matches, Africa Cup of Nations matches and qualifying matches, and country-level matches between domestic clubs. So the first example is the 2009 Egyptian-Algerian World Cup dispute. In a bout to determine who would be the lone Arab country in the 2010 FIFA World Cup, the countries of Egypt and Algeria faced off in an already heated rivalry that created a rift not only between the clubs but also citizens of each nation and its governments. The Algerian team needed 1 point victory to qualify for the 2010 World Cup, and the Egyptian team needed to win by 2 goals to earn a rematch or by 3 to directly qualify for the World Cup. Egyptian fans ended up attacking a bus transporting the Algerian team and injured 3 players, resulting in Algerians retaliating against Egyptian companies and property in Algeria. Algeria ended up winning, but it did create sort of a tiff between the two nations. The second example is from 2010, the Togo national football team attack. It qualified for its 7th Africa Cup of Nations after finishing 2 points ahead of Swaziland in Group 11 of the qualification round. But on January 8th, 2010, 2 days before the start of the Africa Cup of Nations tournament, the Togo national beast was attacked, or national team bus was attacked by gunmen as it traveled through the Angolan province of Cabinda for the Cup of Nations. It ended up killing 3 people. The Angolan government called the incident an act of terrorism, with separatist guerrilla group Front for the Liberation of the Enclave of Cabinda, rebels who had been fighting for the region's independence, later saying that they had carried out the attack. According to Reuters, the terrorist group claimed that as long as the Africa Cup of Nations tournament is played on Angolan soil, fresh homicides will be committed. So that's another example. And the third example I'd like to mention is the 2015 Equatorial Guinea Stadium riots. So in a scene that was described as a war zone, a few questionable challenges ruled in favor of the visiting Ghana squad. And the home Equatorial Guinean fans showed visible signs of displeasure after a penalty was awarded to the visitors. Their fans claimed that discrimination was based on nationality, led to the calls ruled against them, and this introduced a nationalistic prejudice to the situation. According to the SCAD database, 4 recorded instances of social conflict relating to the Africa Cup of Nations competition were registered in Equatorial Guinea in just 1 week's time, and additional 2 instances were registered. Altogether, 36 injuries were reported, with no reported deaths. So to close this presentation, since Africa has experienced less interstate conflict than other continents in the contemporary era, we did not expect to see very meaningful results. So shifting the framework from nationalism's effect to interstate conflict, we see slightly stronger empirical evidence, but the presence of conflict shifts from the qualifying countries to the non-qualifying countries in each instance, except the gross number of interstate conflicts following the qualification round. The results achieved in this study do not mean to denounce the significance of sport in the fields of political science and international relations. Rather, future research should further seek to analyze the premise of international sport's effect on nationalism in the field, which can be very useful for interpreting history, constructing theories, and making arguments to policymakers. The study should not be the end-all in analyzing sport's influence on conflict and aggression, but encourage future studies at various levels of competition, including at the national level. It would also be interesting to see sport's influence on nationalism in non-conflict or non-aggression contexts. Several scholars have encouraged political scientists to take the question of how sports influence politics more seriously, and major sporting events are important social phenomena as they can provide insights that are relevant to existing theoretical debates in political science and sports studies. Studies such as Bertolli's and hopefully this one provide exciting steps to insert sport and culture into the field of political science. Thank you so much for watching this, and this is a pared down presentation of a paper I wrote, so if you have any questions or want more information on this topic or this paper, feel free to email me. I'm happy to be connected and I'm looking forward to hearing from you if you have any questions. Thank you so much.